The Joe Rogan Experience.
I was watching a talk that you were giving, and you were talking about the growth of innovation and technology and GDP over the last 100 years. And you were talking about the entire history of life on Earth and what a short period of time humans have been here. And then during what a short period of time, what a stunning amount of innovation and how much change we've enacted on the Earth in just a blink of an eye. And you had the scale of GDP over the course of the last 100 years. It's crazy because it's so difficult for us with our current perspective, just being a person, living, going about the day-to-day life that seems so normal, to put it in perspective time-wise and see what an enormous amount of change has taken place in relatively an incredibly short amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, we think of this as sort of the normal way for things to be. The idea that the alarm wakes you up in the morning and then you commute in and sit in front of a computer all day and you try not to eat too much. And that if you sort of imagine that, maybe in 50 years or 100 years or at some point in the future, it's going to be very different. That's like some radical hypothesis. But of course, this quote unquote normal condition is a huge anomaly any which way you look at it. I mean, if you look at it on geological timescale, the human species is very young. If you look at it historically, for more than 90%, we were just hunter-gatherers running around and agriculturalists what the last couple of 100 years, when some parts of the world have escaped the Malthusian condition, where you basically only have as much income as you need to be able to produce 2 children. And we have the population exploit. Like, all of this is very, very, very recent. And in space as well, of course, almost everything is ultra-high vacuum. And we live on the surface of this little special crumb. And yet we think this is normal and everything else is weird. But I think that's a complete inversion. And so when you do plot, if you do plot, for example, world GDP, which is a kind of rough measure for the total amount of productive capability that we have, right? If you plot it over 10,000 years, what you see is just a flat line and then a vertical line. And you can't really see any other structure. Like, it's so extreme, the degree to which humanity's productive capacity. So if one looks at this picture and we imagine this is now the normal, this is the way it's going to be now, indefinitely, it just can't seem a prima facie implausible. Like, it sort of doesn't look like we are in a static period right now. It looks like we're in the middle of some kind of explosion.
Explosion. And oddly enough, everyone involved in the explosion, everyone that's innovating, everyone that's creating all this new technology, they're all a part of this momentum that was created before they were even born. So it does feel normal. They're just a part of this whole spinning machine, and they jump in, they're born, they go to college, next thing you know, they have a job, and they're contributing, they're making new technology, and then more people jump in and add on to it, and there's very little perspective in terms of like the historical significance of this incredible explosion technologically. When you look at what you're talking about, that gigantic spike, no one feels it, which is one of the weirdest things about it.
I mean, you kind of expect every year there will be a better iPhone or whatever, right?
If not, we'd be upset.
For almost all of human history, people lived and died, and so absolutely no technological change. And in fact, you could have many, many generations. The very idea that there was some trajectory in the material conditions is a relatively new idea. I mean, people thought of history either as, some kind of descent from a golden age, or some people had a cyclical view, but it was all in terms of political organization. There would be a great kingdom, and then a wise ruler would rule for a while, and then like a few hundred years later, their great-grandchildren would be too greedy, and it would come into anarchy, and then a few hundred years later, it would come back together again. And
yes.
So it would be all these kind of the pieces moving around, right? But no new pieces really entering. Or if they did, it was at such a slow rate that you didn't notice. But over the eons, the wheel slowly turns, and somebody makes a slightly better wheel. Somebody figures out how to, irrigate slightly better. They breed better crops, and eventually there is enough that you could have enough of a population enough brains that then create more ideas at a quick enough rate that you get this industrial revolution. And that's where we are now, I think.
Elon Musk had the most terrifying description of humanity. He said that we are the biological bootloader for artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're here for.
Well, bootloaders are important.
They are important, but I think there's like objectively and there's personally. Like objectively, if you were outside of the human race and you were looking at all these various life forms competing on this planet for resources and for survival, you would look at humanity and you go, well, clearly it's not finished. So there's going to be another version of it. It's like, when is this version going to take place? Is it going to take place over millions and millions of years like it has historically when it comes to biological organisms? Or is it going to invent something that takes over from there? And then that's the new thing. Something that's not based on tissue, something that's not based on cells. It doesn't have the biological limitations that we have, nor does it have all the emotional attachments to things like breeding, social dominance, hierarchies, all those things are no consequence to it. It doesn't mean anything because it's not biological.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think millions of years. I mean, what number of decades or whatever. But it's interesting that even if we set that aside, we say machine intelligence is possible for some reason. Let's just play with that. Then I still think that would be very rapid change, including biological change. And I mean, we are doing making great advances in biotech as well, and we'll increasingly be able to control what our own organisms are doing through different means, and enhance human capacities through biotechnology. And so even there, a lot is not going to happen overnight, but over an historically very short period of time, I think you would still see quite profound change just from applying bioscience to change human capacities.
Yeah, one of the technologies or one of the things that's been discussed to sort of mitigate the dangers of artificial intelligence is a potential merge, some sort of symbiotic relationship with technology that you hear discussed. Like, I don't know exactly how Elon's Neuralink works, but it seems like a step in that direction. There's some sort of a brain implant that interacts with an external device, and all of this increases the bandwidth for available intelligence and knowledge.
Yeah, I'm sort of skeptical that will work. I mean, good that somebody tries it, but I think it's quite technically hard to improve a normal, healthy human being's say cognitive capacity or other capacities by implanting things in them, and get benefits that you couldn't equally well get by having the gadget outside of the body. So I don't need to have an implant to be able to use Google, right? And there are a lot of advantages to having it external. You can kind of upgrade it very easily.
You can shut it off.
Hopefully you could do that even with implant. And once you start to look into the details, there's sort of these kind of demos. But then if you actually look at the papers, often you find, and then there were these side effects, and the person had headaches, or they had some deficit, and the speech, infection. Like, it's just, biology is messy.
Yes.
Maybe it will work better than I expect. That could be good. But otherwise, I think that the place where it will first become possible to enhance kind of human biological capacities would be through genetic selection, which is technologically something very near.
You mean like CRISPR type?
Well, so that would be editing, right? When you actually go in and change things. That also is moving.
What do you mean by selection?
Well, so this would just be in the context of, say, in vitro fertilization. You have usually some half dozen or dozen embryos created during this fertility procedure, which is standardly used. So rather than just the doctor kind of looking at these embryos and saying, well, that one looks healthy, I'm going to implant that, you could run some genetic test and then use that as a predictor and select the one you think has the most desirable attributes. And
so this could be a trend in terms of how human beings reproduce, that we instead of just randomly having sex, woman gets pregnant, gives birth to a child. We don't know what it's going to be, what's going to happen. We just hope that it's a good kid. Instead of that, you start looking at all the various components that we can measure.
Yeah, and so, I mean, to some extent, we already do this. There are a lot of testing done for various chromosomal abnormalities that you can already check for. But our ability to look beyond clear, stark diseases that is one gene is wrong, like to look at more complex traits is increasing rapidly. So obviously there are a lot of ethical issues and different views that come into that. But if we're just talking what is technologically feasible, I think that I mean, already you could do a very limited amount of that today, and maybe you would get, 2 or 3 IQ points in expectation more if you selected using current technology based on 10 embryos, let us say. So very small. But as genomics gets better at deciphering the genetic architecture of complex traits, whether it's intelligence or personality attributes, then you would have more selection power and you could do more. And then there is a number of other technologies we don't yet have, but which if you did, would then kind of stack with that and enable much more powerful forms of enhancement. So there, I don't think there are any major technological hurdles really in the way, just some small amount of incremental further improvement.
That's when you talk about doing something with genetics and human beings and selecting for the superior versions. And then if everybody starts doing that, the ethical concerns, when you start discussing that, people get very nervous because they start to look at their own genetic defects and they go, oh my God, what if I didn't make the cut? Yeah. Like I wouldn't be here. And you start thinking about all the imperfect people that have actually contributed in some pretty spectacular ways to what our culture is. And like, well, if everybody has perfect genes, would all these things even take place? Like, what are we doing really if we're bypassing nature and we're choosing to select for the traits and the attributes that we find to be the most positive and attractive? Like, what are like that?
Right. And you think what would have happened if, say, some earlier age had this ability to kind of lock in their their prejudices, or if the Victorians had this, maybe we would all be whatever, pious and patriotic now or something.
Yeah, we know, like the Nazis.
So in general, with all of these powerful technologies we are developing, there is, I think the ideal course would be that we would first gain a bit more wisdom, and then we would get all of these powerful tools. But it looks like we're getting the powerful tools before we have really achieved a very high level of wisdom.
Yeah. But we haven't earned them. The people that are using them are sort of we haven't, like, think about the technology that all of us use. How many pieces of technology do you use in a day, and how much do you actually understand any of those? Most people have very little understanding of how any of the things they use work. They put no effort at all into creating those things, but yet they've inherited the responsibility of the power that those things possess.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only way we can do it. It's just way too complex for any person. If you had to sort of learn how to build every tool you use, like you wouldn't get very far.
Isn't that fascinating, though, when you think about human beings and all the different things we do? We have very little understanding of the mechanisms behind most of what we need for day-to-day life. Yet we just use them because there's so many of us and so many people are understanding various parts of all these different things that together collectively we can utilize the intelligence of all these millions of people that have innovated, and we, with no work whatsoever, just go into the Verizon store and pick up the new phone.
Yeah, I mean, and not just technology, but worldviews and political ideas as well. It's not as if most people sit down with an empty table, try to think from the basic principles up what would be the ideal configuration of the state or something like that. Yeah. You just kind of absorb it and go with it. You float in the stream of culture, and it's amazing just how little of that actually at any point channels through your sort of conscious attention, where you make some rational, otherwise, but like deliberate decision. Most you just get carried away with. So, but that again, I mean, if we have if this is what we have to work with, then
Yes.
there's no other way.
There's no other way.
Possibly, no.
There's no other way, and there's no way. Even like you and I discussing this, like discussing the history of this incredible spike of evolution or innovation rather in technology, it just doesn't feel like anything. It feels normal. So even though we can intellectualize it, even though we can have this conversation, talk about what an incredible time we're in and how terrifying it is that things are moving at such an incredibly rapid rate, and no one's putting the brakes on it. No one's thinking about the potential pros and cons. We're just pushing ahead.
Yeah. Well, nobody. No.
Not no
I mean,
one, but
there
a
are
very
a few
small-
people. I've got my research group.
Yes.
There's actually increased. I mean, when I got interested in these things in the 90s, and it was very much a fringe activity. There was some internet mailing list, some people exchanging ideas. But since then, I mean, there's now a small set of academic research institutes and some other that are kind of actually trying to do more systematic thinking about some of these big picture topics.